goal is to try to help make sense about what's going on in the economy. And in the process, we'll talk about the things you care most about, the consumer and interest rates and our housing or housing bubble and everything that will impact the broad economic environment that's relevant for all of you going forward. And I think most of you know that there are sort of three broad scenarios that are currently in vogue describing where the economy will go over the next year or two. There are some people calling for a deep recession resulting from a complete collapse in housing markets, with housing prices plummeting, new construction experiencing huge declines, and that this will drag the whole economy down with it. On the other side, there are some people who are claiming that notwithstanding an adjustment in housing, that the economy is still doing very well. And in fact, the real problem is inflation. And the Fed will have to and will keep raising interest rates in order to eliminate this serious inflationary problem that they claim is now in place. There are some people, particularly me, who are somewhere in the middle. And I'm going to try to convince you over the next hour or so that the way to plan your business over the next year or two is for, if I had to pick, the terminology that would best describe it, something like a soft landing scenario, that the doom and gloomers, and we always have doom and gloomers in this profession, and there are times when it's hard to understand why, and a good example of this, those of you who were here last year, you remember we talked about the fact that, things were somewhat more problematic, and that, while we thought things would be okay going forward, that there were some risks and the economy might not be quite as buoyant as it was in the prior 2 or 3 years, which is essentially what's happened. But if you go back 2 and 3 years ago, anybody who knew what was going on in the economy, who knew how companies were planning their business, who knew what the key drivers that were impacting the economy were, had to be relatively optimistic. There was no case whatsoever, barring somebody blowing up the world or, some extremely unusual, unpredictable kind of event, that the economy would do quite well. And even then, though, despite that, there were, all these doom and gloomers. As I said a moment ago, the place to be, and I'm giving you this right up front, and I'll explain why in great detail, for the next year or two, is to posture your business basically like it's been over the last 6 to 9 months. An economy that's still going to grow, not set any all-time records for growth, modest growth, but that the sort of downside kind of scenario, doom and gloom scenario, has a relatively low probability. And by the same token, I wish I could come here and tell you that we're going to, the economy is going to make a great run, and economic activity will grow even more rapidly than it's been, and lift everybody's business up while it's growing like that. I can't tell you that either. It's quite unlikely. The probabilities favor something in the middle, and that's what I'm going to try to outline for you as we go forward. I think it would be helpful, though, if we start by briefly reviewing what's happened in recent years, why it's happened, how we've got where we are now, and why things that are now happening in the economy will impact, and how they will impact the economy going forward. Those of you who follow the economy closely will remember that after a booming 1990s, one of the greatest periods of economic prosperity in the history of this country, we went the entire 10 years of the 1990s without a recession. Just an extraordinary period of economic growth and prosperity. But when the decade ended, and it's not coincidental, by the way, because part of the reason the economy began to slow down in early 2000 was the aftermath of Y2K. So many companies bought new equipment and new software at the end of the 90s because the stuff they had installed was not Y2K compliant. They sort of bought equipment and software before they really needed it. So orders for high-tech and for capital goods and software plummeted when the new century began, and that was one of the leading reasons why the economy overall almost hit a brick wall in early 2000. And for 3 years, until the spring of 2003, the economy alternated between slow growth, stagnation, and recession, depending upon which month or which quarter during that 3-year period you looked at. But when you capsulize it on an overall basis, we had sort of a mediocre economy, almost stagnant, for 3 years after that run we had in the 1990s. We began to notice a change in the spring of 2003. And again, for those of you who've been here in recent years, we've talked extensively about this before, so I'll summarize very briefly. The economy began to accelerate, and that was 3.5 years ago. We're now in October 2006. We've had steady economic growth ever since that upturn began in the spring of 2003. It's been a little slower in recent months, but at least the economy is continuing to grow. Depending upon what statistic you use, however, you could argue that this has been a great period of prosperity, or you can argue that it has been a mediocre expansion, because the different economic measures have performed very differently. Now, when I say the economy has grown, I'm basically referring to GDP, gross national product, the broadest measure of economic activity we have, and it's been okay. This is the 11th post-recession period we've had since World War II. We've had 11 business cycles since then, and if you rank them in terms of GDP growth, how strong the expansion is for the first 3.5 years, this is among the weakest. It's in the bottom third. So 2/3 of them have been stronger than this. However, if you measure it by corporate earnings or corporate profitability, this has been far and away the strongest economic expansion we've had since World War II. We've had almost 4 years now when corporate earnings have grown at a double-digit rate, almost 20% on average during this period. And to put it a little differently, during this, more than 3.5 year period, corporate earnings have grown at a rate more than twice as fast as corporate revenues if you look at the economy as a whole. That's extraordinary. Another way of saying that is profit margins have jumped dramatically and are now essentially at an all-time high. Not in every industry. Obviously, they're very high in the oil industry and not so high in some others, but when you average it out across the economy as a whole, it has been a huge run of corporate profitability. On the other hand, if you measure it by job creation, this has been the slowest of the 11 post-war expansion or post-war, post-recession periods. So, you just get different measures. Overall, I think it's fair to characterize it as being okay, certainly a lot better than it was at the start of this at the start of this century. Not spectacular, but it's been a pretty good run for the economy. And the question, and I mentioned a moment ago, it was slowing. And the question becomes, obviously, is this going to continue? Or has this somewhat slower pattern we've had over the past 4 or 5 months the start of a process that will lead us into another recession or period of stagnation? And I told you where I come out on this, and I'm going to explain why in great detail in a moment. But just one or two other sort of aspects of this recent pattern of economic performance. An important question: why did the economy turn up in the spring of 2003, and why has this period of expansion continued ever since that time? And again, if you talk to different people, you get different answers. I'll tell you what I believe, and based on the evidence and all the modeling we do, far and away, factor number one is the sharp decline in interest rates we had in prior years. And I'm sure most of you who live in this world, you remember the days, it was only 10 or 15 years ago when mortgage rates were double-digit, when short-term interest rates were much higher, and we've had a declining trend in interest rates ever since. That's helped the economy in several ways. It has led to an absolute boom in housing by making housing more affordable to more families. And I think all of you know we've had a huge increase in the home ownership rate during this period. The percentage of American families who own at least one home is now almost 70%. 10 years ago, it was 64%. I mean, it's an extraordinary difference, largely the result of declining interest rates, or in this particular case, declining mortgage rates. And as all of you know, the drop in mortgage rates has helped the economy indirectly in another big way as well. We've had one refinancing boom after another. Every time mortgage rates, ratcheted down another point, more and more families refinanced, either reducing their monthly payment, freeing up purchasing power for other goods and services, or taking a lump sum out of their house and kept their mortgage rate the same, just increased the size of their mortgage, and they'd spent that lump sum on a new car or modernizing their home, whatever it is, anything, lots of different things. So it helped consumer spending dramatically as well, in addition to the direct effect it had on the affordability of housing. So that, in my opinion, was factor number one, and a very significant part of the economic growth we've had over the last 3.5 years has come about for this reason.